and welcome everybody on the call to Wild Sarasota, Florida's native bats. So a little bit more about me. Here's just a bit about my background. I have a bachelor's degree in environmental studies from up in the Great White North, Buffalo, New York, which is where I'm from. And then I also have a medical degree. I was a physician for about 15 years. And then 4 years ago, I decided to go back to my original career, and I took the position as the Ecology and Natural Resources Educator for University of Florida IFAS Extension here in Sarasota County. I currently live in Oscar Scherer State Park. I've actually lived here now for over 20 years with my husband, who is the current park manager of Oscar Scherer. And we have 2 children, both of which are at home with us currently. Thanks to COVID, we have a whole bunch of animals that live in the house with us too. And then just to share a little bit of information, if you're not familiar with the Extension Office, and this reminds me, one of the things I like to do is have you guys open up your chat box. So as Meryl told you, you can move your cursor around on your screen until your toolbar pops up, and then there should be an icon for the chat box there, and you can click on that. And I'd love for you to just enter in where you are right now. Where are you watching this webinar from? On Monday, we had people from the Middle East and the UK and all over the United States. So I'd love to hear where you guys are from. All right, so while you're doing that, I'm going to tell you about IFAS Extension Sarasota County. There is an extension office in all 67 counties in our state and in all states in our country. They are associated with land-grant universities and are a partnership between the land-grant university in that state. For us, it's University of Florida, the county that we're in, and the USDA. And our job basically is to take the research from the university and share it as education to our community to help them solve issues that they may be having. So we have lots of different, sorry, I'm going to go back again. We have lots of different program areas where we can assist you. For instance, somebody today brought me in a frozen lizard that was about 2 feet long. So my job is then to identify that lizard, which it's not a native lizard, and then help that gentleman figure out what he can do about those lizards that are on his property. So that's one of the things I do, and we have lots of other people that can help you with lots of other issues. So please feel free to contact your local extension office. And then these are just some of the program logos. You may be familiar with some of these. Meryl, for instance, is a master gardener, and we probably have a few master gardeners on the call today. And then up in that upper right-hand corner, that's the logo for the Florida Master Naturalist Program. That is one of the main programs that I teach. It's a University of Florida program that's taught throughout the state to provide information about our Florida ecosystems and our natural environment. So if that's something you love, you might want to take one of those classes. All right, so let's move on to why we're all here. We're here to talk about bats today. So I'm going to spend about another 40 minutes talking to you about bats. And then there'll be some time for Q&A. So as Meryl mentioned, please feel free to type your questions into the chat box, and then she will read them to me at the end, or we'll let you unmute at the end as well. So we're going to cover the natural history of bats, some of the common bats in our area, some of the myths about bats, which tend to lead to some of the fears that people have or the concerns people have about bats. So I'm going to try to debunk some of those myths and help some of you that might be a little bit afraid of bats feel more comfortable and maybe even learn to love them. We're going to talk about some of the threats to bat populations in our country and how we can welcome bats into our neighborhoods. Not just how we can welcome them, but why we should. And then a little brief information about what do you do if a bat flies into your house, for instance. All right, and here's a lovely example of one of our Florida native bats, the Rafinesque big-eared bat. Look at that lovely specimen of a bat, so cute. All right. Oh, this is such a cute bat too. This is not one of our Florida native bats, but that is a flying fox bat. It's one of the fruit bats. And the fruit bats are some of the largest bats of all the different bat species, but these are generally more in tropical rainforest type areas, more what we would think of as rainforest or jungle, where some of those tropical fruits are growing. So we do not have these larger fruit bats here in the United States. So let's talk a little bit about the natural history of bats and some of their really unique and amazing adaptations. So they are, of course, mammals. They are one of our, or they are our only true flying mammal. Sometimes people will say to me, well, what about flying squirrels, which we also have here in Florida? Well, yes, flying squirrels are mammals, but no, they do not really fly, even though that's their common name. So flying squirrels have a flap of tissue that goes sort of from their upper limb along the edge of their body to their lower limb, and that allows them to sort of glide. They can jump and glide a little bit. So they are gliders. They do not, flying squirrels do not have true powered flight where they can flap some type of wing structure to keep themselves moving. So really our bats are our only mammals that have true powered flight. And they are in the order Chiroptera, which is a scientific name for them that is translated as hand wing. So they basically have the same types of bones in their wings that we have in our hand. And so right here where you see the number 1, that is their thumb. This is their second finger, which would be our pointer finger. This is their third finger, fourth finger, which is our ring finger. And then the number 5 here is their pinky finger, which for us is usually our smallest finger, and for bats is often the longest one. So, and this is their wrist bones here, and then their arm bones that are right here, which are also very similar to the bones that we have in our arm. So very similar structures, which is sort of cool. And you can see from the diagram on the slide, similar structures to other mammals as well. And there are actually a lot of different bats, and they make up about 25% of the overall mammals in our world. So 25% of the mammals in our world are bat species. Bat species typically are really small. Most of them are less than 50 grams, which is about 1/10 of a pound. So I figured out what that really meant, because when I say those words, it really, I can't picture that. It doesn't really make any sense to me at all. So I looked up other things that weighed about 50 grams. And so think about a package of 2 AA batteries, the AA batteries, or 10 nickels. That's 50 grams. So most of our bats weigh less than that. So they are much smaller than we might think they are in our imagination. And their wings also are about 85% of their total body surface. So their bodies are pretty small, and then most of it is really just their wing structure. And we have bats that roost in both foliage, so like in cabbage palm, fronds, and on the bark of trees, and in Spanish moss. And then we also have bats that will roost in larger structures like caves and buildings and things like that. Some bat species prefer to live in those larger colonies, which can be thousands of bats in number. And some bat species like to just live alone. They're just loners. Another really unique adaptation that allows bats to survive in our world is this thing they do called echolocation. So basically what echolocation is is the bats are able to emit this high-pitched sound that is at a higher wavelength than our human ears are able to hear. So we don't hear this at all, but the bats can emit this high-pitched sound that then bounces off the structures in front of them and returns to them, which allows their brain to process that information and basically know where everything is that is ahead of them. This is really such a cool adaptation to have when you're a nocturnal animal. So of course, bats are coming out at dusk, they are flying around at night. And so this helps them basically see. They're not really seeing visually this way, but it helps them understand their environment and be able to catch their food. They also can turn really quickly. They can turn 180 degrees in 3 wing beats. So they flap their wings 3 times and they can be facing the opposite direction. Pretty cool. So our bats here in Florida are insectivorous, meaning they only eat insects. And boy, do they eat those insects. Many bats will eat up to 25% of their weight each night. So I figured this out from a Facebook Live presentation last night. Hold on just a second. Meryl, if you can mute people as they come in, that would be great. Bats can eat 25% of their weight in insects. And for my presentation last night, I figured out sort of what this would mean for a human being. So if you're 100 pounds, okay, I know most of us on the call are probably more than 100 pounds, but we can pretend. So it makes the math easier. So if you're 100 pounds, that would be like you eating 25 pounds of pizza every night. Linda, I can see you shaking your head. Can you not eat 25 pounds of pizza every night? Oh yeah, there's the thumbs up. I thought maybe you could. So that's equivalent to about 12 pizzas. So bats are eating a huge amount of food every night, considering their body size. And they need to eat that for all of that energy they expend flying around throughout the night, finding their food and water. And then if you're a mommy bat who is lactating, so of course bats are mammals, so they feed their babies milk. So if you're a lactating female bat, you're going to eat 70 to 100% of your body weight. So that's like eating 100 pounds of pizza. That's just amazing. So they spend a lot of time flying around and eating a lot of insects. Now, they don't preferentially choose to eat mosquitoes, but they do end up eating a lot of mosquitoes. So that's one really good reason to like bats. They also eat some other insects that actually can damage our agricultural crops. So that's a second good reason to like bats, is they are not only eating the insects that bother us by biting us, but they're also eating insects that could damage our food crops. Some bats, not really the ones that live here in Florida, but some bats, like that large bat we saw earlier, consume fruit. Some will even eat small fish, frogs, and small mammals. And then we'll talk about the vampire bats in a minute, but they're not in Florida, so don't worry about that. The main thing that eats bats are owls. So if you think about it, bats are going to be out near dusk and throughout the night. Same time owls are out. So bats become prey to the owls. Hawks also, if they're out around the same time. Snakes, raccoons, and possums may be able to get to the bats where they're roosting during the day, or may be able to get to the young bats that are in the maternity colonies when the young bats can't really protect themselves. So that's other predators that the bats may have. So let's talk a little bit about bat reproduction. So here's a picture of a mother bat with her baby. And most bats mate primarily in the fall and winter. And how long the gestation period is, which is the period before the baby is born, depends on usually the size of the animal, or in this case, the size of the bat. We do have some really, really tiny bats and then some that are larger. The larger bats will often have a longer gestation period. So it can be up from like a month to 6 months. Generally, most bats only have one baby, and the babies are called pups. A few bats will have twins, and some of the larger bats may have up to 4 pups, but the majority of bat species only have one baby and usually only have babies once a year. So a lot like humans, but they don't live as long as us. So they're a slow reproducing animal, which also can impact their population over time. Males don't help raise the young, so it's all up to the moms, and those little babies will fly within 3 to 6 weeks of being born. All right, so let's talk a little bit about our Florida bats. We have 13 different bat species throughout the state of Florida that are native to our state. We have also identified 7 what we call accidental, or sometimes we say incidental species. And those are the bats that maybe get lost while they're migrating, or they cross over the border from Georgia, or they come up from one of the islands, and we see them in South Florida just once or twice in history. So we do have a few other species that might just show up accidentally here, but really we have 13 resident bat species. And 10, or I think 11 of those 13 are actually considered species of greatest conservation need by the FWC, which is our Fish and Wildlife Service. And that's because our bat populations worldwide are decreasing. And so we have 10 or 11 species that are really struggling to maintain their population here in Florida. 2 of those are actually also considered federally endangered as well. So we really only have 2 native species that seem to be doing well in terms of their population that we aren't worried about currently. Our Florida bonneted bat is our largest bat. It is about 34 to 47 grams, so still smaller or weighs less than those 2 AA batteries, but it has a wingspan of 20 inches. So that's, that's a pretty good size wingspan, but not very heavy, that's for sure. So this is just a list of all the species that are native here in Florida. The ones in yellow are the ones that are considered those species that are of greatest conservation need. The 2, including our Florida bonneted bat, which is our largest bat, the 2 in red are the ones that are endangered federally. And then the 2 that are in green, which are the velvety free-tailed bat and the evening bat, those 2 are the ones that the populations seem to be doing well. Do you guys hear the sound?
This is the University of Florida Bat House and Bat Barn. It was constructed as a means of providing alternative habitat for the native insect-eating bats that live in this part of the country. There was a original historic building on campus known as Johnson Hall that burnt down in 1987, and there was a colony of bats living in the attic. And once the building burned down, the bats were next found to be infesting the concrete bleachers in track and field stadium. So the idea was proposed to build an alternative habitat for bats, as well as excluding the bats from the stadium where they were creating a nuisance. So the idea of the Bat House was conceived by Lee Bloomkamp, who was my predecessor in the pest management division here at UF. And this original Bat House came permanently occupied in 1995. And we decided there was a need for additional habitat space, so we built the Bat Barn, and it has recently become occupied with probably 20,000 or so bats living in the Bat Barn. We're guessing that the total population right now is probably somewhere around 250,000 bats, and it seems to be recognized, or it is recognized, as the world's largest occupied bat house. And these 250,000 bats are probably responsible for eating roughly a ton or a ton and a half of insects per night. But since they are mammals, they also carry rabies. Probably 1 in 200 bats in a normal population could be positive for rabies. But the likelihood of a bat found on the ground it's about 1 in 3 that is positive for rabies. So we make sure that people understand the importance of never picking up or touching a bat, especially when it's lying on the ground, because the bat can bite in self-defense. They have tiny, sharp teeth that can penetrate tender skin, and they can transmit rabies through bites. So make sure that everyone is advised, and the children especially are warned to never pick up or touch a bat on the ground because of the likelihood that there could be rabies transmitted through a bat bite.
I'll try to show you video later of the bat houses I was at last night, which might be the bat houses you're a little bit more familiar with that are smaller and they are installed on poles out in the open. So we'll take a look at that video later. All right, so, oh, actually we're gonna take a look at it after I talk through this slide. So there have been a couple efforts at monitoring some bats here in Sarasota County. There's probably more than these. These are just the ones I know about. In spring of 2017, here at Oscar Scheer State Park, the biologists monitored the bat species and they identified 5 different species of bats that were here. And then I did some bat monitoring last year on June 12th and at the Venice Rookery, and I identified hoary, velvety free-tailed, Brazilian free-tailed, and maybe a Florida bonneted bat as well. Those are the ones that are sort of rare, so I'm not sure if my monitor made a mistake or if it was correct. I'm going to try to show you the video in just a second. Well, this will be the last one, so if this one doesn't work, we'll just keep moving on. But in the video, I think I have it set up to start right where I'm starting to talk about and show the bat monitor that I have. It's a little tiny device that gets inserted into my cell phone, and it picks up the ultrasound frequencies of the echolocation that the bats are sending out. And then it translates it into a sound wave that you can actually listen back to and hear with our human ears. And it identifies the bat within 2 of the most likely species. So that's why I say possibly I monitored a Florida bonneted bat last year there. Also last night, I came up with a few identifications for Florida bonneted bat, but it might have been one of the more common bats like a hoary bat instead. I'm going to move it along so that you can see them emerge. Hey, there they are. And there they all sort of flood out. So usually what'll happen is it's usually about 8 minutes after sunset, we'll get 1 or 2 bats that'll start leaving each house. And then 1 or 2 bats out of another house. There's like a few that start out, and then about within the next 5 minutes, all of a sudden you just start seeing so many bats emerge. So those are the houses at the Venice Rookery, and they're just south of the Rookery. All right, I'm going to stop that. And there's currently 6 houses there. And those houses can have up to a couple hundred bats in each of those houses. So you saw as they started flooding out that there were quite a number of them in there. And it's just really a fabulous thing to get to see. So I highly recommend that you go down there if you get a chance. So just look up on your cell phone what the official sunset time is, get down there just a few minutes before that, because they'll come out about 8 to 10 minutes after official sunset. All right, so let's talk about some individual bats. So this is our hoary bat. I love these. Look at how they're called hoary bats because the tips of their fur are frosted white. And they are one of our most widespread bats throughout our country. They are also in Florida, our 2nd largest bat. And look at that, 20 to 35 grams. So they're really about the weight of a single AA battery or 5 or 6 nickels. That's just crazy. And you can see the size of them in this researcher's hand right here. So they are pretty small. These guys are solitary foliage roosters. So they're the ones that they might be on the underside of a cabbage palm frond, for instance. They have a furred tail membrane that they wrap around themselves to keep themselves warm. So it's like they have their own little blanket that they wrap around themselves. And these guys are long distance migrators. So they can migrate all the way from South and Central America, all the way up into Canada and back. They also will fly really high, upwards of 8,000 feet. And because of this, unfortunately, one of the threats to the populations of the hoary bat is the wind turbines that are also up at a higher elevation. And these bats can have twins. They can have two babies, which is actually quite unusual for bats. Here's our Brazilian free-tailed bat, also identified here in Sarasota County. These are one of our colony roosters. So these are one of the ones that will roost in hundreds or thousands per colony. And they can fly faster than any other bat. It's like each of these bats have their own special superpower. So Brazilian free-tailed bats can fly up to 100 miles per hour. And they do a nice service for us. We call it ecosystem services or biological services when parts of our natural environment actually provide a service that's useful to us, which really everything is useful to us in the natural environment. We don't sometimes just recognize it. But they will eat some of our insect pests that actually can be a problem for our agricultural crops. Here's the tricolored bat. So the tricolored bat is named that because its fur is actually multiple different colors. It's black at the base, more like yellowish in the middle, and then brown at the tip of the fur. And they are really tiny. They are so tiny that they can be mistaken for moths. And they will eat 25% of their body weight, you know, like that 12 pizzas for a 100-pound human. They'll eat 25% of their body weight in just 30 minutes. So they will really consume. The tricolored bats population has really been affected by the white nose syndrome, which is a fungal disease that is another big threat to the population of bats. We have not identified, at least since I most recently checked, we have not identified white nose syndrome here in Florida, but it is in a number of our other Southeast states like Georgia. It tends to primarily affect a lot of the species that will live in large colonies inside caves. So the researchers are keeping a lookout for this, but currently we don't have white nose syndrome in Florida. Here's the Seminole bat. This one has mahogany colored hair that's frosted at its tip. And it also has a furred tail located within the membrane. So you can see down here, the membrane has sort of been folded over, and this is the tail that is inside the membrane. The bats who are named free-tailed bats, that's because their tail is free of the membrane or outside the membrane. So our Seminole bat has its furred tail inside the membrane. The Seminole bats, these are one of the species that really like to roost in Spanish moss. And some of the threats to the population of this species is there are still people that make their living from gathering Spanish moss. We still use Spanish moss, for instance, in a lot of decorative items and craft projects. And so this can pose a hazard to their population. And also blue jays are a threat to this population, as the blue jays will eat the babies of these bats. Evening bats. These are a colonial species that will migrate south, and some of them will travel 340 miles during migration. They are more the forest dwelling bats, so they like to get in the crevices of bark. So if you think about our live oak bark that's very furrowed, that's one of the places that they might like to roost. And they feed once per night. And some researchers I don't know how they figured out these numbers, but they did some research on a colony of 300 bats, and it was reported to have consumed 6.3 million insects in a single summer, that one colony. So that's pretty amazing as well. And the yellow bat is one of the largest bats in the eastern United States. And this one is named because its fur is normally sort of yellowish in color, and the wings are typically a little bit darker than the color of the body. And because this is one of our larger bats, this is one of the species that can give birth to 2 to 4 pups or babies instead of just the normal single baby. And these guys will feed by flying sort of just above fields or grasses or even golf courses, and get the insects that are sort of scared up or moving just above the grass level. All right, so let's talk about some myths about bats, because a lot of people feel a little bit nervous about bats, don't like them, feel uncomfortable around them. So let's try to ease some of those fears or change some of those misconceptions. In some cultures and countries, bats are actually considered a good omen. China believes that bats bring good luck. Egyptians saw them as a cure-all for a number of diseases. And in some African and Pacific Island nations, bats are actually considered important and sacred. So let's talk about bats and rabies. So it's not really a myth, because yes, bats can carry rabies. They are a mammal, and yet they get sort of a bad reputation around this, because it is much rarer for bats to carry rabies than some of our other animals like raccoons. So here in Sarasota County, raccoons are our #1 vector or animal that's going to carry rabies. Now, bats can get rabies. Here it's about 0.5% of bats, so it's a really small number. And bats also don't get aggressive if they do contract rabies, so they're not going to fly at you because they have rabies. That's just, they're not going to try to attack you if they are sick. What you do have to be careful of is a sick or injured bat is likely to be on the ground. And so you never want to touch a bat that's on the ground, even if it looks dead, because it might not be dead. It might just be stunned or too sick to move. So if there is a bat lying on the ground, you want to leave it alone. You want to not touch it. You could, if you wanted to dispose of it because it's on your property or near where children or animals might be, you could consider picking it up with a long-handled shovel and putting it in a garbage bag, or you can call Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission if you feel that the bat is ill or dead and you're concerned about that. So just to try to dispel the concern that all bats have rabies and they're going to fly at you and give you rabies, that is highly unlikely. Just never pick up a bat that's on the ground. All right, so how about this one? This is very Halloweenish, right? Bats are blood-sucking fiends, those vampire bats. Dracula is going to come out and get you. So Hollywood and the movies have really created this fabulous character around bats and given bats sort of a bad reputation. There are 3 species of vampire bats in the world out of 1,300 different species of bats. So yes, there are 3 species of vampire bats. They do not live here. They live more in South America type area. And they do not like grab onto people's necks and suck their blood. No, they will nick the back of something, of a large animal like a cow, sort of a large slow moving animal. And they will nick the back of the cow with their teeth, and then they will lick up the blood. And this is just part of their diet, and the cattle do not usually even know it's happening. So certainly not as exaggerated as Hollywood has made it be. And then another common myth is that bats will fly into your hair and nest in your hair. So if you ever get a chance to go out to bat houses and see bats emerge at night, and you stand pretty close like I was last night, Yes, the bats will fly pretty close to you. Or if you have lots of bats in your neighborhood and you're out taking a walk at sunset, yeah, they might fly pretty close to you. You know why? Because the insects are flying close to you, and those bats are so smart and they have that amazing echolocation, and they know exactly where you are, and they do not want to bump into you, but they sure might want to eat that insect that's flying around your head. So bats may fly close to you, but they have no interest and are not likely at all to bump into you or get into your hair, and they don't build nests, so they're certainly not going to try to nest in your hair. So we think that this was actually a rumor that has its origins in trying to deter young females from going out at night and getting themselves into trouble. So one of those types of myths. So let's talk briefly about some of the threats to bats. Here's a picture of a bat that is, I hope, just resting on the umbrella by somebody's pool deck. So once again, as humans come closer to contact with where wild animals live, there's going to be more wildlife and human interaction. And there's going to be more habitat loss and fragmentation too. So thinking about how can we help preserve habitat for these bats? How can we help maintain places that they would live, or keep the types of trees in our yards where bats could naturally reside, or maybe even helping with habitat by putting up bat houses, especially like they have at UF and the Venice Rookery, when they know that bats were in the neighborhood or in the building and they needed to give the bats somewhere else to live. Pesticide use can affect the food supply of bats. So especially our Florida native bats, as we talked about, are all insect eaters. And so if we overuse pesticides, we are potentially harming the environment, but we're also killing off the food supply for the bats. So I'd way rather welcome some bats into my neighborhood and let them eat up the mosquitoes than to use pesticides to do that, or at least use a minimal amount of pesticides and use some of these things that biologically will control the insects. We talked about the wind turbines already being an issue for some of those higher or longer distance flying bats. We talked about the white nose syndrome. Guano is the name for their scat or poop. So guano mining is actually a thing that happens because the guano can be used as fertilizer. And so going into areas, often this is done in caves. So going into these large colonial sites where bats are roosting to take away their guano can be destructive to them, can introduce diseases like white nose syndrome. And then people have historically killed bats as well, often out of fear for them. So these are things that have affected their populations over time. So when we want to welcome bats, think about all the benefits that bats have for us. So we're going to talk about those. So when we talk about integrated pest management, that's choosing multiple ways to manage pests or insects, things you don't want to have around. We don't want to just use the chemicals. We want to use some of these other things that are more balanced and healthy for the environment. So bats are actually part of our integrated pest management because they're going to eat tons of those insects. In fact, it's estimated that bats provide free pest control that economically translates to about $3.7 to $53 billion a year. So they're really helping us out with that. In some areas, they are pollinators, more so out in the western states in our country, like in the Southwest in the desert. We have some bats that actually pollinate the night blooming plants. So it's important to the plants, and many of our bats that do eat things like fruit are also going to disperse the seeds of that fruit as well. So they provide a service for our ecosystem in terms of plants. And then there's some information about their guano content. It's about a 10:3:1 NPK ratio. in terms of utilizing it for fertilizer. And they are being studied both scientifically and for use in medicine. They're studying their ability, because the vampire bats especially have the ability to, in their saliva, have an anticoagulant that stops clotting when they are trying to lick up the blood from those cows. Now I feel very Halloween-y. So the bat saliva is being studied for medications, for anticoagulation, for instance. Sonar and navigational ads were actually under development based off of what we learned about their echolocation. So we have learned a lot and continue to from bats. So as we mentioned, if you're going to welcome them, we want to reduce our pesticides. We want to help maintain their habitat. I'm going to skip our question. Okay, and we're getting near the end. And if you happen to have a bat somewhere where you don't want it, like in your lanai or in your attic, if you just have a bat that somehow ends up getting into your lanai or into your house just by accident, one of the best things to do, if you can, is to open the doors or the windows in the room that the bat is in, turn on the lights, and wait for sunset. Because at sunset, that bat is going to want to go on about its business and go off and try to find its food and its more normal home. So that's the best way to just let a single bat that gets into a structure out. If you have bats that start to take up residence in something like an attic or some other building, you cannot actually remove the bats between mid-April and mid-August. That's because that's their maternal or their breeding season, and that's when the maternity colonies form. So even if you were to try to let the bats leave at sunset and then close up whatever hole you found that they had been getting into, the problem with doing that between April and August is if there are babies in there, you have now trapped the babies without the moms. And that's inhumane, and they're going to die, and it's actually really unhealthy for you as well to have dead bats in your attic or other structure. So it is actually against the law to do any exclusionary techniques from mid-April to mid-August. But the rest of the year, you can stand outside your building or house. You can, at sunset, watch where the bats come out from, which will give you an idea of how they're getting in. And there are different exclusionary techniques. Many of them are some type of netting or mesh that you cover the hole with and leave the bottom part open. And then you just watch for the next few nights. And you wait until you are sure that all the bats have come out. They won't be able to get back in because they won't be able to get back up and under. But the bats that are still in there should be able to get out. And you want to make sure they all get out, and then you can plug that hole. Here's an example of a bat house. And these, like you might have noticed in the video from last night, they are generally mounted on single poles away from buildings and other structures, because you don't want predators to be able to climb up a tree or climb up the edge of a building and get into the bat house and eat the bats while they're roosting or eat the babies. So these are generally sort of in an open area on a 12-foot high pole that can't really be scaled by a raccoon or something like that. Here are some resources. I know on Monday we had a lot of people say, oh, wait, I need those resources. The best resource to learn more about bats are, in my opinion, the second and third one here, because they have lots of pictures. FloridaBats.org is our Florida State sort of conservation organization for bats. BatCon.org, that's an international bat conservation organization, and Merlin Tuttle, who is like a famous bat photographer, has a lot of photos on that site. So those sites will give you both beautiful photos and information to learn more.